Hello everyone, welcome to this video discussion on reading visual arts. In this video, I shall be talking about introductory concepts which will help you understand what reading visual arts is and its importance. So in this video, I shall be talking also about the different skills that we will be needing in order for us to comprehensively read visual arts. Before we proceed to my discussion, let us have a critiquing of this picture first. How do you see it? What is your interpretation of this picture? Some of you might think that this is just an ordinary picture of a woman paddling on a sea or in an ocean. Well, some of you might also take it figuratively, thinking like there could be a deeper meaning to this picture. Well, it depends now on our experiences, on our interpretation, or maybe on our life stories on how we see this picture. That is how important reading visual arts is. It is very necessary for us to possess reading skills in the field of visual arts because it will help us better understand multimodal text and at the same time unravel meanings accurately. So in the context of visual arts, what is reading? Now, I'd like to point out that reading in the visual arts is totally different from the usual reading of books or other passages. Because when we talk about visual arts, this already involves a lot of elements. It's not purely text. It could be multimodal, meaning there could be visuals, there could also be oral elements, there could be colors, lines, angles, pictures, texts, or sounds. And all of these elements need to be considered when reading visual arts. So now, we should understand what reading visual arts is. Now, when we talk about reading in the context of visual arts, it is an active and creative process. It is active because it activates our minds and it allows us to fully scrutinize the different elements present in the visual arts. It is also creative because we allow our imagination, our interpretation to understand different meanings in the visual text. Now, when reading the visual, we draw on our general and specific knowledges, tastes and habits, our personal context to make what we see and make sense of it. Well, when we look at a certain picture, let's say a multimodal text, we do not interpret it based on what we actually see only. We interpret it based on our experiences, based on how we feel about it, based on how we see it. That is reading visual arts. So it becomes an active process because it also activates our general and specific knowledge of things. What do we know about those elements present in that multimodal text? Or it may also activate our personal context. What are our experiences which lead us to understanding that given visual text? Now, understanding visual art is context dependent. We cannot really say that there is one perfect way of interpreting things because, again, people are unique in terms of experiences or in terms of how they see the world. And so it follows to say that understanding visual art is context dependent. It heavily depends on the context of the picture. Now let's go back to the picture I showed you during the first slides of my presentation. Well, I mentioned that some of you might think that this is just an ordinary picture of a woman in a sea, or it could also have a deeper meaning to it. Okay? Now, if we try to contextualize it, some of us might think that this is me, or this is you in the middle of life crisis, in the middle of life struggles. And you may equate the ocean or the sea to your life or to the vastness of life, and you are that person paddling in the middle. So that is how you contextually interpret visual arts. You have to activate your general knowledge or your experiences. You have to go back to how you see the world in order for you to produce that interpretation or meaning based on your personal experiences. Now, there are three main points in seeing as reading, and we will be discussing each one of these three. First one, we see things we are actively engaging with our environment rather than simply reproducing everything within our line of sight. Truth be told, when interpreting visual arts, we do not interpret it based on what we actually see only. As what I mentioned a while ago, it is an active process. And so we allow our inner selves to be engaged in the reading process. How do we do that? One, we engage with our environment rather than simply reproducing everything within what we actually see in the text. For example, if you see there a visual art or a multimodal text, you do not interpret that based on what you actually say only. You also interpret it based on what is happening around you or based on what is happening around that visual art. Second one, every act of looking and seeing is also an act of not seeing. Some things must remain invisible if you are to pay attention to other things in view. Now, we know that a multimodal text contains a lot of elements. There could be text, there could be signs, there could be sounds, there could be visuals or other movements present in that multimodal text. And when we interpret it, it is quite impossible for us to interpret all elements at once. And so it is very necessary for us to break down all of these elements and try to focus on one element first before we get a holistic perspective of all these things present in that multimodal text. Hence, this follows that you need to pay attention to one specific thing or element only in that multimodal text and try to weave it, try to link it with the rest of the elements so that you can produce a meaningful insight out of that visual text. Third one, the extent to which we see focus on and pay attention to the world around us. It is not always about us when we interpret the text. It could also be about the realities of the world. Now, these three actions are inextricably linked. It depends upon the specific context in which we find ourselves. So, for example, when you see a visual art and then that time you are sad. And when you interpret that one, the emotion that you have during that interpretation process could also affect your interpretation of the rest of the elements present in the visual art. So your world may be taken to somewhere else where your emotion is situated or positioned. Same goes when you are, let's say, happy. When you're extremely happy, then when you interpret visual arts, you would look at it positively. It's because it is your world during that time. You are in a happy world, you are in a blissful or joyful world, and so your interpretation will also be affected by that. However, when interpreting or reading visual art, it's also important to consider not only your emotions, not only your perspectives, but also the context around that visual art. Let's say, what is happening around you? Is everybody happy during that moment? Or is everybody feeling like a totally different emotion? So all of these things need to be considered in order for you to read visual arts effectively. So, as what I mentioned, it's context dependent. We need to understand based on the context and not based on what we can see at our line of sight. Now, first concept that is very important to talk about is cultural literacy. This refers to a general familiarity with and an ability to use the official and unofficial rules, values, genres, knowledge, and discourses that characterize cultural fields. In this sense, it is not just familiarity with a body of knowledge, it also presupposes an understanding of how to think and see in a manner that is appropriate to the imperatives of the moment. When we talk about cultural literacy, that means understanding the context of that specific culture, understanding the context based on the cultural norms and mores. Now, if we are to understand this one, in order for you to read visual arts effectively, you need to have high literacy of the culture in order for you to dig deeper into the meaning. Okay? Because sometimes there are visual arts or multimodal texts which are culturally sensitive or which could be linked to the culture of the maker of that visual art. So for example, if you see a certain visual art and there are certain words used in it which are not familiar to you, it could also be because the maker of that multimodal text could have a cultural reason or background for that. Okay? Or it could also be adjusting to the moment when that multimodal text was made. So for example, let's say you have found a COVID-19 signage somewhere in the road. And then You have seen there that most of the words written there are in Cebuano or Davao Binisaya. Now, if you were to understand that one, you would think like, why is there a need to have all texts in that multimodal text written in Cebuano or Binisaya? Now, if it's only in your perspective or based on your perspective, you would say that it should have been in English because English is the universal language. But cultural literacy will tell you that those texts in the multimodal text, let's say in that signage, must be written in Binisaya because not everyone can understand English. Well, it's for the public interest. That is where our skills in terms of cultural literacy or cultural understanding will come into play. It will help us to fully understand that there are also cultural reasons, societal reasons or justifications as to the elements present in every visual art or multimodal text. Now, this boils down to our cultural trajectory. Seeing something from a cultural perspective, meaning this is our perspective of things. So for example, if you think or if you believe that COVID-19 or a pandemic-related signage must be written in English, your cultural trajectory is like that. That all text present there, the written ones, must be in the English language because you believe that English is the universal language. So that's your cultural trajectory. But from the perspective of those who made that multimodal text or that signage, their cultural trajectory tells us that it should have been in Bisaya because public would definitely understand it more easily if all text in a COVID-19 signage are written in Binisaya or Davao Cebuano. Okay? So that is cultural trajectory, something that you can also use for you to improve your cultural literacy. Apart from this, it's also very vital for us to understand the different techniques of seeing as reading. The way we see these visual arts will also enable us to read visual arts more effectively. First one is the selection and omission. This one tells us that every act of looking and seeing is also an act of not seeing. When you see a visual art or when you see a multimodal text, you do not look at it based on all the elements present in that multimodal text. There are really moments when you try to disregard the rest of the elements and focus on one element only. So that is the process of selection and omission. Here, selection of details and omission of others helps to constitute and make the visual. By paying attention to and focusing on something, the viewer effectively constructs a frame around the scene. So when you say frame, meaning you have one frame of understanding into it. So let's say you have a COVID-19 signage. And in that signage, you can find, let's say, a mask, okay, images of virus, and then a text which states, stay safe at all times. Now, if you focus on that multimodal text, you may actually center your attention to these three elements present in that multimodal text. So there are two images and a statement. Now, the process of selection and omission will tell you that you may actually omit the rest of the elements and focus on one element only. So let's say I would like to focus more on the text, stay safe always. So in that case, selection comes in when I choose that statement, stay safe always, and omit the rest of the elements in the multimodal text. So in that case, I will not consider the rest of the photos or images or elements present in the multimodal text and instead center my attention on the line or the statement itself. Stay safe always. Now, if my understanding or perspective will focus on that line, stay safe always, I am actually constructing a frame, and that frame is within that statement only. Stay safe always. So if I were to interpret that one, selection and omission will tell me that I should focus more on the statement, stay safe always, and so it actually channels a strong or impactful message to me that I should stay at home and be safe always. Okay? So that is where my frame goes, or that is how my frame is constructed. Now, how useful selection and omission are. When we talk about selection and omission, they're actually very useful in reading visual arts because it allows you to focus on one element only. And later on, try to focus as well on the rest of the other elements, which were not interpreted during your first or at first glance or at first look. And this will also allow you to create a holistic perspective of all the elements present in the multimodal text. Now, in that case, you can actually create a meaningful insight out of that multimodal text because you have focused on one element and then onto another element, and create a holistic perspective until such time that you can form one meaningful understanding or comprehension of that multimodal text. So that's how useful selection and omission are. Now, selection and omission can be productive in two ways. First one, it suggests a set of relationships between and stories about different aspects. As what I mentioned, there are different sets of relationships between or among the elements present in that multimodal text. And it may also establish a hierarchy with regard to the potentially visible. So for example, when you say hierarchy, meaning there is a specific order in the way you interpret things. So for example, let's go back to the one I cited a while ago. I'll focus more on the statement, stay safe always. So in my hierarchy, that goes first. And then the next one, I'd like to focus more on the picture of a mask. So in my hierarchy, that goes second. And then I'd like to focus last on the picture of the virus. So that goes third in my hierarchy. Now, if I were to look back at my hierarchy, then first I'll go with the statement and then followed by the picture and then another picture. And once I have completed this hierarchy, an interpretation of each one of these elements in the hierarchy, then I can proceed to evaluation. That's where how I evaluate everything or all elements present in the multimodal text and create meaning out of these elements. So that's how you read visual elements. That's how you read visual text. You do not go immediately to understanding all of the elements all at once and create meaning all at once as well. So you need to dissect all elements present and then create meaningful insights from each element. Okay? This time, let's talk about seeing in time and motion. A number of elements contribute to or facilitate the process of suturing or uniting the world to make a text. So there are certain elements that we also need to consider when reading visual arts or visual text. First one is color. Of course, we know that there is the so-called psychology of color. And every color represents a specific meaning. So you also need to understand what each of the colors present in a visual text represents so that we'll be able to also contribute a deeper understanding to the holistic perspective of that multimodal text. Second one, you also need to consider the shape. Okay? Not only that, you need to consider the shape or how it is framed or how are shapes utilized in that given multimodal text. Third could also be movement. What does the movement in that multimodal text suggest? Okay, so this now involves the gestures, the body movements of the people, or maybe the rest of the images involved in that multimodal text, so you need to consider them as well. The texture, so the gradient, okay, the texture of the images used in that multimodal text may also have a meaning, or a suggested meaning. The distance or the proximity of an item or of an element from the rest of the elements could also have a suggested meaning. So you need to consider that as well. The lighting, okay? So the background, the shadows, all of these need to be considered as well because they contribute to the holistic meaning of that multimodal text. This time, let's talk about text and intertext. Now, when we talk about text, the name of a group of signs, okay, that is a text, a collection of signs which are organized in a particular way to make meaning. So, for example, I'd like to cite this whole slide flash on the screen as a complete text, meaning it is a group of signs. So you can see their pictures, you can see the gestures, okay, of the one speaking. Then you can also see colors, you have their angles, you have lines, shapes. Now, in totality, all of these compose a text. Now, when we talk about sign, it is anything that is treated as a meaningful part of the unit that is the text. So for example, you have there a letter. A letter could be a sign, okay? Or it could also be the picture that you can see here on the screen is another sign. And every element there in this picture could also be a sign as well. Okay? So that means that a text is definitely composed of many signs. And these signs interplay, okay? They interrelate with one another so that they can produce one meaning for that text. And intertextuality happens when there is a use or the use of other texts to create new texts. So for example, when there is now combination of different texts, that is where intertextuality exists. Okay? So you may refer to the figures on page 27 of your book to fully understand the difference among these three: text, sign, and intertextuality. Now, why is it significant for us to understand these three major concepts? Primarily for us to also learn how to dissect elements more effectively and try to create more meaningful insights out of every element present in the multimodal text. The moment that we understand that the totality of this is actually a text and the rest of the elements present in that multimodal text are actually signs, then that's when we also learn that every sign needs to be understood or examined carefully so that you can create a holistic understanding of the text. And once texts are merged with the rest of the text or other texts, then you'd also understand that there is intertextuality in that every sign in that intertextuality needs to be understood carefully as well. Okay? At this moment, let's talk about text and genres. Now, when we talk about genre, these are actually text types which structure meanings in certain ways through their association with a particular social purpose and social context. There are frames and references that we use to negotiate, edit, evaluate, in a sense, read the visual as a series of text. So for example, you have there painting, a sculpture, a video, okay, a multimodal text, a paragraph. All of these are genres of texts, meaning they could be different types of texts with a particular social purpose. So for example, if it is prose, if it is poetry, it's definitely genre because it has a certain social purpose. If it is a sculpture or if it is a painting, then each of these two could also have a social purpose. And each of these two is a genre. Okay, it has a specific genre. And then there are also frames and references that we can use to negotiate, edit, or evaluate in reading a visual text or reading a visual art. So for example, if you have there a multimodal text composed of a photo or photography, and then you have their text, and then you have their, let's say, a painting, merged all together in one multimodal text, then that multimodal text contains different genres. And our understanding of all the elements or of all the signs present in that multimodal text may also go back to our understanding of the genres. What's definitely the social purpose for each genre could actually help us fully understand why that genre is present in that multimodal text and how does it contribute to the overall meaning of that multimodal text. So that's why it's very important for us to accurately identify the genre of text as well. So my discussion of introductory concepts related to reading the visual arts ends here. I still have another portion of this discussion, so please watch my second video discussion for this one. Now, if you have any question in relation to what I just discussed, you may post your questions on the open forum. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.